Recently, I had a few phone conversations with a patent attorney, basically just to get an idea for what it entails to apply for a patent, what the criteria might be for being granted a patent, and he said something interesting when he brought up a 3-element criteria that he considers when talking about granting a patent. He said that your idea or invention must be new, useful, and non-obvious. The theme for this year's Shields Classic Drum Show in Covington, Ohio was the year of the Dyna-Sonic, and this got me thinking about how this may apply here, and how there's two sides to every story, and the truth usually falls somewhere in the middle. Well, there's two sides to this Dynasonic story as well, and my goal is to get as close to that middle as possible. So to set the stage, please allow me a few minutes to play a couple clips for you. I want you to listen closely to what these men say. We'll first hear from Roger's marketing manager and head of artist relations, Ben Strauss.
I'm getting into why we came up with Dynasonic. When Buddy first started with us, he was playing on a power tone snare drum. And in discussing the product, he asked me, Ben, is it possible to make a drum that will respond easily when you're playing triple pianissimo or triple forte? And I said, I really don't know, but I'll go back and we'll talk to the engineer and we'll see what we can come up with. I said, what's the problem? But he says, well, most drums respond fairly well when you play soft or mezzo forte. But when you lay into it, he says, they seem to fall apart. And I think you know what I'm talking about. I said, yes, let's see what we can do. So I sat down with Joe Thompson and I said, explain to him what Buddy had asked me. And he said, well, let's look into something. Let's see what it was. And we sat down, and Joe did most of it, but I was in the little corner of the picture. What makes a drum sound? How does a drum respond to the player? Now, no one had ever come up with that kind of a question. Give them a drum, and we'd either tighten it or tune it, whatever you want to call it, and that's it. I'm making light of it, but I'm sure some Billy Gladstone wasn't that class, you know. But I used to notice that so many drummers would just take a drum key and go around it and hit it, and they were satisfied. We didn't feel that way. We felt that the drum was a musical instrument, and it should have some kind of a sound. Not just a rhythm maker, but it ought to have some sound. And that's what we strive for. We changed the approach to the snare beds. I always remember that snare beds always were rather deep. And some fellows said, well, they have to be, otherwise the snares won't make contact with the head. So what you're doing is pulling the snares into the head, obviously. Mm-hmm. So then my question used to be, well, what happens to the snare head when you do that? And they'd say, what do you mean? I'd say, you realize that when you're putting pressure on the snare head, before I tell you what happens to your batter head when you put an internal tone control into it? You deaden it, don't you? I said, yeah. I said, then when you pull the snares into the snare head, you're deadening that too. Is that what you want to do? So they'd say, well, what am I going to do? That's the way drums are made today. I said, well, we're going to see if we can change that. And we did. That's really the story behind the Dynasonic.
What I find interesting about not only this short clip, but the nearly 4-hour interview that it comes from, is that there's no mention of his dear friend of 40 years, Ellis Tollin. Just an observation. Let's hear from Ellis.
Right.
Everybody sold Slingerland drums because Gene Krupa played Slingerland drums, and that's what the kids went for.
Right.
And we were selling Ludwig drums. We had gotten an exclusive on it, and I don't know whether it was within the first year. Mm-hmm. We used to fix the drums up. They were so bad, I used to have to mechanically correct them and do this. And one of my students came in and asked me to fix his snare drum, and I started to fix it, and I looked at him. I said, gee, you didn't buy this drum from me. Where did you get it? He said, 8th Street Music. Eddie Hirschman and his brother used to run the place. Anyhow, when I found out that they were buying it from A Street Music, and they were very close friends of mine also, I called them up and I said, "Where did you get the Ludwig drums?" And they said, "From William F. Ludwig, of course." So I called up Bill Ludwig, and I said to him, "Bill," I said, "I'm supposed to have an exclusive in Philadelphia, and you're selling drums 6 blocks away from me. So what are you doing?" He says, "We need more exposure." I said, "Well," I said, "there's only one thing I can suggest." He says, "What's that?" I said, "Take your drum company and shove it." And later on, a guy named Henry Grossman walked in the store, but that's later on. And at that time, I was still burning from the Ludwig thing. And Henry Grossman said, "Gee, Ellis," he said, "we heard all about you." He said, "I'd like to talk to you." He showed me some holders, Swivel-matic drum holders. How are they? What do you think they would do on the market? I said, "Gee, they're great. They got to sell." He said, "I also bought a drum company." I said, "What's the name of the drum company?" He said, "Rogers."
Right.
I said, "Gee, Rogers is, to me, is a toy drum company." I said, I can't handle Rogers drums." He said, "Well, the reason we came to see you is we want to know how can we take this drum company and make it the way you would like it."
Right.
And I said to myself, here's my chance to fix Bill Ludwig. That's all I thought of. I didn't think like a businessman.
Right.
I thought like a drummer, right?
Right.
I said, "I'll tell you what I'll do." I said, "I'll show you how to build the drums and to make the best drums in the world. I'll get you Buddy Rich to play them. I'll get you Louis Bellson. I'll show you how to do drum clinics, because we had been doing drum clinics in the store, not in the store, in the studio in 1947. In 1948, we started doing drum clinics.
Right.
I said, I'll even show you how to build the best snare drum in the world." So I designed a Dyna-Sonic snare drum.
Okay.
Right? I never asked for royalties. My head wasn't in that particular.
Right.
All I wanted was for Rogers to now have the best drums on the market, and for them to give me an exclusive.
Right.
Which they did, and Henry Grossman was a man of his word. He stuck by it all his life until he sold the drum company.
And here as well, no mention of Ben Strauss, or even Joe Thompson for that matter. Again, just an observation. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Jurassic Park, where billionaire John Hammond recreates dinosaurs and they wreak havoc on this island. Well, there's a scene in that movie where Mr. Hammond takes the paleontologists and botanists into a small theater and shows them a clip of how they went about recreating these dinosaurs. In this clip, it explains how they had discovered prehistoric mosquitoes preserved in sap, and how they would drill into this sap and with a syringe extract the dinosaur DNA. Any strands missing from this dinosaur DNA, they would fill in with frog DNA. Now this feels a bit like what I'm doing here. My years of research is the drilling into the sap, the words of Ben Strauss, Ellis Tollin, all of the Covington employees and their family members who I've spoken to would be the dinosaur DNA. And any small strands missing from that DNA, I will respectfully and logically fill in with frog DNA. Now we all know the men who were involved, and the snowstorm story is well documented. When Ben Strauss and Joe Thompson traveled to Philadelphia to Ellis Tollin's home, got snowed in for a couple days, and spent time in the basement developing what would become the Dynasonic frame system. That brings us back to the patent attorney and new, useful, and non-obvious. Let's put new to the side just for a second. Useful. Is this Dynasonic frame system useful? Of course it is. Most of us have used it with great success. This gentleman seems to be having a wonderful time using it, as unattractive as he is. Non-obvious. The example that was used to explain this to me by the patent attorney was the common mousetrap, something that had been patented since the late 1870s. And if I wanted to patent my version, which had a steel base instead of the common wood base, that would be too obvious and not patentable. Which brings us to new. Your invention has not been in the public for more than 1 year before the filing of your patent application. Not only had this frame system not been in the public eye for a year, it hadn't been in the public eye for decades. What am I getting at? It's obvious to me that the Dynasonic frame system concept is based on something that Leedy developed in the 1920s called the Marvel snare strainer system. This was marketed as a system that would keep the wires under tension even when released, and also as a system that would make changing wires a simple process. The marketing also mentions it assures you full vibration under pianissimo or fortissimo blows without readjustment of the tension screw. Note that the snares lie level and do not bend over the edge of the shell. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This Leedy Marvel system was a frame or bar system that would raise and lower the wires under tension. And when shown in a side-by-side comparison here with a Joe Thompson prototype, I can't help but notice that they look eerily similar. This Leedy idea is said to have been cataloged for only 1 year in 1925 and failed because of a faulty strainer that wouldn't engage or would disengage when playing, but the idea was there. The idea was there so much so that you can plainly see the tension adjustment screw. The idea was there, but it failed because of a faulty strainer. And what did Rogers have? Rogers had one of the best, if not the best strainers on the market at the time, and they had Joe Thompson, who would greatly improve on this Leedy concept. Let's talk about the men involved for a minute. Henry Grossman, brilliant businessman, entrepreneur, not a drummer. Ben Strauss, marketing wizard and arguably the best artist relations man in the business, also an accomplished trumpet player, not a drummer. Joe Thompson, mechanical engineer, inventor. The word genius is thrown around when speaking of him, quite frankly because he was. What was he not? He was not a drummer. I personally find it slightly difficult to believe that any of these fine men, brilliant in their own right but not drummers, would be aware of an obscure Leedy snare drum mechanism from 1925 that was basically out of production in 1 year. You know who I do believe would have been aware of this system? Ellis Tollin. Ellis Tollin was a drummer whose professional career started in the 1930s. He was also a man with his finger on the pulse of drum innovation and what drummers desired and need. Mr. Strauss mentioned snare beds in that video you saw earlier. It is well documented that Ellis despised the snare bed and saw them as inconsequential, ineffective, and even futile and impractical. As a matter of fact, many of the things that Mr. Strauss says in that long video interview, I'm told, are direct quotes of things that Ellis Tollin would say regularly. For example, when talking about bearing edges, Mr. Strauss mentions how the head should sit on the edge the way the strings of a violin sit on the bridge. Ellis's family tells me that this is something Mr. Tollin preached regularly using that very example. Allow me to read from an interview that Ellis did with his friend Dick Culley in the late 1990s. This is Ellis talking. I asked Ben, did you ever play drums? He said, no, I play trumpet, but I've sold drums in the stores that I've worked in. So I asked him if he knew what makes a good or a bad drum. He said, the way you tune it? I replied, there's a lot more than that. So he asked me to tell him. I began to tell him that the shell has to be smaller than the hoops so that the head can float. I told him that the shell construction has to be sturdy so when you strike the top head, the shell doesn't move in towards the center. The snare wires have to be suspended against the bottom head without choking it so that regardless of the volume level that you're playing, you will still get a complete response. He said, how do we go about doing that? I told him step by step. Then I started talking about bearing edges. I told Ben that the bearing surface is where the head vibrates from, just like the strings of a violin vibrate between the neck and the bridge. Dick Culley says, I read somewhere that it was Ben Strauss who used that violin analogy. Ellis continues, he was referring to things that I told him many years ago. Remember, Ben Strauss was not a drummer. He was a wonderful human being who was very adept at listening, learning, and paying attention to details. He was dedicated to his job, creative, and interested in setting up dealerships around the country. When Ellis talked, they listened. As for Buddy's involvement, who Ellis brought to Rogers, by the way, being friends since they were very young. In that same interview with Dick Culley, Ellis says, a short time later, I spoke to Buddy about Henry and Rogers. The timing was perfect because Buddy was available and looking for a drum company to endorse. I explained the situation to him and he said he was interested. I told Henry and he said he would be available to meet with Buddy at his convenience. Henry flew to Philadelphia where we met and we went to Buddy's apartment in New York. I introduced them to each other and Buddy asked me in Henry's presence, Ellis, what kind of drums are these? I told Buddy, right now they are not professional instruments, but Henry guarantees that Rogers is going to produce them the way we want and that they will be up to our standards that we always spoke about and will be better than anything else on the market. Henry agreed. So Buddy confirmed, If Ellis says these drums are going to be good, then that's okay with me. Then I stood up and said, "Gentlemen, excuse me while I get a glass of water, you guys talk." I walked out of the room. I knew beforehand what Buddy was going to ask for and didn't want to get involved. So Buddy and Henry spoke alone and came to an agreement, and Buddy agreed to endorse Rogers' drums. Ellis also mentions that when Rogers supplied Buddy with his first drum set, it was delivered to his store, Music City in Philadelphia, with a 22-inch bass drum, which Ben Strauss does talk about in that interview, and a holiday snare drum that Ellis specifically ordered with 10 lugs. Ellis says, "I dismantled the drums and worked on the bearing edges." In Ben's version of the story, Buddy was the driving force behind the Dynasonic. I'm sure as a recent powerful member of the Rogers roster, when he mentioned he wanted a responsive drum, I'm sure they listened. Buddy Rich was for sure a catalyst to get it done and a sounding board during the process, but I don't believe he was involved any more than that. Buddy was not in the business of developing snare drums. Buddy was in the business of playing snare drums. So in wrapping up, allow me to present to you a hypothesis that I've prepared on the way that I believe the development of the Dynasonic happened. Armed with the dinosaur DNA from years of research and gathering information from trusted sources, and logic filling in the minor strands of frog DNA, my hypothesis. In the early 1950s, when Henry Grossman had first acquired Rogers and realized that he would have to relocate the company to Ohio, they came to a conclusion that they would need a real drum expert to guide them. Grossman reached out to a man named Dave Hyman, who was with the music wholesale company Gretchen Brenner. Mr. Hyman went to visit Grossman in Cleveland, and upon gathering an understanding of the task at hand, he recommended George Way. More than interested, the people at Grossman Music reached out to George Way, who respectfully declined the offer. Way felt that Grossman had a long, tough road ahead of him to become competitive in the drum market because in Way's opinion, what Grossman had just acquired as far as drums was, and I quote, "a bunch of junk which had garnered no drummer acceptance in the marketplace whatsoever," end quote. Mr. Way, with respect for Henry Grossman, felt that though it could be done, that this would be an expensive and time-consuming, discouraging endeavor. So Henry Grossman, Ben Strauss, and Joe Thompson moved on without their drum expert, building drums and slowly growing the company. In the mid-1950s, a competitor at a NAMM show insulted the Rogers equipment on display, which lit a bit of a fire under the Rogers brass to lean on their strength and make their mark on the industry. Their strength at the time was Joe Thompson. Rogers went on to revolutionize the drum hardware industry with Joe Whitenack and Mr. Thompson's invention of the Swivomatic ball and socket holder, collet plates, and knobby plates. Now it was time to follow up with the drums as well. Just as they had went to George Way some years earlier, this time, armed with Swivomatic and its innovation in their corner, they approached another man who was well respected in the drum world, Ellis Tollin. Though Ellis absolutely loved the hardware, he was not as pleased with the actual drums themselves. But being a savvy businessman himself, driven by being recently betrayed by Bill Ludwig, Ellis saw an opportunity. An opportunity that would benefit everyone involved, while also quenching his thirst for reprisal in the form of a highly competitive product. The involvement of Mr. Tollin would benefit the Rogers Company, the drummers buying the new product, and his own business if he is offered exclusive rights to sell this revamped new product in his greater sales region, which he is granted. Ellis shares with the Rogers brass his decades of experience in what makes a drum desirable to a player and a consumer, recommending multiple aspects such as sharper bearing edges and a slightly undersized shell to employ Rogers' own version of the leady floating head principle. For anyone unfamiliar with the leady floating head principle, leady would make their calf heads about 1/8 of an inch larger than their shells to assure that the head rested on the bearing edge without the flesh hoop pressing against the shell. Rogers would make their shells about 1/8 of an inch smaller than the advertised size to accommodate the ever-growing popularity of plastic heads, which did not have the flexibility of a calf head, and again, allowing the head to rest on the bearing edge without the flesh hoop pressing against the shell and choking the drum. Ellis also recommends an idea for a snare drum that will do away with snare beds and snare wires choking the drum and again revolutionize the drum world based on the leady marvel concept. I believe this is the discussion that took place during the snowstorm visit at the Tollin residence. From here on out, the brilliance of Joe Thompson takes over, where he slowly re-engineers the Leedy Marvel concept through a series of prototypes, trial and error, and soundboarding the likes of Buddy Rich, Louis Belson, and Ellis himself. Ellis recalls receiving a prototype where the frame was off-center, to which he responded that the frame would have to be in the center of the drum. Ellis has stated that he long fought for the complete elimination of snare beds for this drum that they were designing, but was met with some resistance by the folks at Rogers, and in the end there was a compromise when the Mind Trust agreed upon an ever so slight snare bed be installed on the Dynasonic. By late 1960 or early 61, this re-engineered aluminum frame holding the snare wires with multiple adjustment options was named Dyna-Sonic by Ben Strauss and released to the world with great success, bringing well-deserved adoration. This drum, in conjunction with other slight changes mentioned previously, propelled the innovative Rogers Drum Company to one of the greatest drum manufacturers in the world. In January of 1962, a patent for this new, useful, and non-obvious design was filed, and in December of 1963 was granted. Of all of the things discussed here today, one thing is not arguable. Whether rightfully so or not, there is one name on the patent: Josephus B. Thompson. Thank you for watching.